Good afternoon. What a wonderful sight to see this sacred space filled with people today as we come together to celebrate our founder here at Episcopal Homes. She was an incredible woman, Sister Annette. It is President's Day, but also the 100th day of her death. And this day has been recorded now in history. It will be Sister Annette Rolfe Day in St. Paul on February 16th from here on out. So what a fabulous thing to have all of you present today. I want to welcome several people, but I want to start off today and recognize a couple in particular. Many of you knew her great niece, Katie Rolfe Carlson, who passed away this past Thursday, and I would be remiss not to mention her. Are there other family members here of Sister Annette? If you could wave your hand or stand. All back there. As we begin today, I would like to invite you into just a couple moments of silence so that we can recognize both Sister Annette's presence with us and Katie's presence as well. The Celtics say that when we do this, when we are mindful of those saints in these places, that their presence really is there, that our attendance in this room will be doubled. And certainly many saints have been in this room. So let's just take a moment to be silent and to welcome them in as well. Thank you. So I'd like to say just a few things about some different people, and I'll start with Katie, her great niece, Sister Annette's great niece. She served on our board here in the 1980s, continuing her great aunt's legacy. Katie remembers her father telling her stories about great aunt Nanny as a very old lady, always clothed in long black habit of a deaconess who, despite her austere appearance, always pulled a piece of candy from the large pocket hidden in her habit. And Katie served as Episcopal Homes was expanding to build Beckettwood, and she was the co-chair of our Celebrate the Journey Capital campaign, expanding our campus to include Seabury, Cornelia, where we are today, and an extension to Iris Park Commons. Katie brought leadership and zest to our work. She was a true visionary who shared her powerful influence. And as her memory failed, Katie's influence continued as our board recognized the need to offer memory care here at Episcopal Homes. And so our new assisted living memory care, Katie's Cottage, is named after her. And like I said, Katie died just 4 days ago on February 12th. And she would like to be remembered for her and her words, "I was always happiest when I was helping others." So we remember Katie today, and we are grateful that her daughter, Mary Lilja, is here, and who is also Sister Annette's, I guess, great-great-grandniece. And she is currently serving on our Episcopal Homes Board. Mary's communications company, Lilja Inc., provided the layout and design for Dave Kinney's book, A Heart in the City, and you'll hear from Dave Kinney as well today. For other family members are David Carlson and Dan and Jane and Kay and many others. So her legacy goes on in all of you who stood up before. So I'd like to thank those who will be presenting: Marvin, our CEO, and Bishop Brian Pryor, the 9th Bishop in the Episcopal Church in Minnesota. Dave Kinney will be presenting. Shelley Rux will be presenting as well. And Sister Annette will be joining us too. The highlight of the program. And just one final word, we recognize that Sister Annette was the founder of many, many things. She was the founder of Sheltering Arms, the orphanage that started off at Beckettwood. And so in many ways, she was the founder of Beckettwood. Her spirit lives on there. It lives on in the funds that Sheltering Arms provides for projects for youth and children, and in YouthLink, which is actually in St. Barnabas Hospital, the current building. They provide apartments for homeless youth today at this time. So we just remember all of Sister Annette's works and recognize her. So I will conclude my part by reading to you the proclamation of Sister Annette Rolfsday that you find inside your bulletin. Mayor Chris Coleman was unable to be here today, so I'll read this in his stead. Whereas Annette Rolfe came to Minnesota from Missouri in 1871 at 31 years old to follow her call to church missionary work. And whereas after training in nursing and social work, sponsored by the Episcopal Church, Annette was consecrated by Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple in 1874 as the first sister of the Episcopal Church in Minnesota, and thereafter dedicated herself to the disadvantaged and vulnerable people in Minnesota. And whereas the clergy wished her well, but the financial burden of her work rested on her shoulders, Annette Rolfe sacrificed all she had, living on bread and water when necessary, to make her dreams of helping others a reality. And whereas Sister Annette's first enduring organization, Sheltering Arms, founded in 1883, continues to serve Minnesota's youngest and most vulnerable citizens. And whereas Sister Annette established a home in 1895 for aging women in the pioneering city of St. Paul, which evolved into what is now the Episcopal Homes of Minnesota, a continuum of care community now serving over 500 seniors and providing state-of-the-art homes and services. And whereas Sister Annette died on February 16, 1915, in a home that she created for others, and whereas the city of St. Paul and its residents are grateful for the courage, commitment, and legacy of care that Sister Annette provided for this community. Now, therefore, I, Christopher B. Coleman, Mayor of the City of St. Paul, do hereby proclaim Monday, February 16, 2015, to be Sister Annette Rolfe Day in the City of St. Paul. So I would now like to welcome Martin Pocket to speak.
It is so nice to see so many familiar, friendly faces. I'm delighted to see that on this special day that there are many people standing in the back. Almost every chair is full. I was hoping that we would receive this kind of response. I know that I find myself deeply humbled and in awe of the leadership of Sister Annette some 121 years ago for our organization, but further back for the other organizations that she founded. What a tremendous inspiration she has been to so many. And it is, as I said, I'm deeply humbled that we're continuing on her work today. You know, today, once in a while, management and I, we stress over budgets, but it's nothing compared to what she experienced back in that day. Pre-Medicare, pre-Medicaid, pre-elderly waiver, pre-Social Security, right? So today, we have to fundraise and we have to work hard at it, but it's nothing compared to what they had to do back then. When they had to go door to door, raising money to pay the coal bill, to heat the building, etc. So what an inspiration of leadership, a person who just wouldn't say no. But I was asked to speak about more today. The others might harken back to the past more. So, you know, I have been here for only 16 of the 121 years. And so it's all modern history to me. But you know, we have undertaken some ventures that I believe would make Sister Annette feel very proud today. The way we assist those of all means. So on our campus, we serve the very low income and we serve people of substantial means. And it mixes very comfortably in one community. One of the things that we do well is we have played a major role, as you know, in revitalizing University Avenue in St. Paul. I had to chuckle as I read a few words from the first chapter of the book that you're going to be seeing and you're going to hear about in just a few minutes at home in the city. I'm just jumping here in the middle here. An elderly correspondent said, the woman asked only that the home be located somewhere close to churches and shopping. Old age is lonely at best, she wrote, and we would want to see a little of the outside world passing our windows. You know, University Avenue, right there. I think we have satisfied this person's wishes. The world is passing by right in front of our window, and we had a profound impact on University Avenue when we opened Seabury there some 12 plus years ago. Since we brought our housing back to University Avenue, the first organization in 50 years, some 1,000 units have either already been built on University Avenue or have been announced. Fortunately, I didn't know back then that we were the first organization in 50 years to bring housing back. I would have been quite frightened had I known that. So I'm delighted I didn't. But to just wrap things up, as you know, we've just opened our newest project, Midway Village. It is a $46 million project, the largest one in modern history by far. And that took a lot of sweat. I believe once again that we are making Sister Annette proud. The first 2/3 opened full immediately. The last third we just opened a few weeks ago, and we are in the process of filling that. And the last third is the innovative greenhouse model of care for skilled care. Greenhouse representing living, thriving, growing, in contrast to a traditional older model of care where a person is just waiting. So living, thriving, growing, it's the newest, and we believe it's the best model of care in the country today. So we're very proud of that. Once again, continuing on that heritage that we've inherited. And you know, there are so many current board members and former board members in this room. And think about it, we all connect way back 120 years to Sister Annette Realm. What an honor.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Kaylee. Blessing to be with you. So on some levels, you may be wondering why we would make the day of a person's death the day that we celebrate. But in the church, that's always our understanding about that's when saints become saints. When we enter into God's greater glory, that's why it happens on this day. So it's very fitting for us to be honoring on this day Sister Annette, as we really honor her as one of our great saints of the Episcopal Church in Minnesota. Well, I think the most telling words from Jesus was when he said, "When did you see me hungry? When did you see me naked? When did you see me a stranger?" And then when he said, "When you fed me, you held me, and you welcomed me." I think all of those things are really iconic of the good work that Sister Annette did, and that all of us really are on the shoulders thereof. For those of you, with apologies for redundancy, for those of you who read my weekly blog, I want to share a piece to you from, it comes from a book called More Than a Roof, The Development of Minnesota Poor Farms and Homes in the Aged by Ethel McClure. She writes the following piece. There she found a fertile field for her activities. Following an initial period as a parish teacher in Faribault, Sister Annette moved to Minneapolis, where she served from 1877 to 1882 as a matron and nurse in charge of Cottage Hospital, now as St. Barnabas. In her spare time, she started a Sunday school at St. Jude's Mission. And that wasn't enough, obviously, for her. Resigning from her hospital position in 1882, she began the work that led to the establishment of the Sheltering Arms Home for Children. Quote, "With your blessing last August," she wrote to my predecessor, Bishop Henry D. Whipple, on May 12, 1883, "I rented a house and made a beginning of a church orphanage. Though expecting aid and sympathy of the church throughout the diocese, I assumed responsibility for all the debts." Music to the words to a bishop. "There is a pledge of $500 towards a new building. It is God's work, and He will provide the means." Sister Annette then surrenders the institution at that time, located at 12th Street and 20th Street Avenue South, to a board of trustees, and in May 1885 turned her energies to a new venture, the church home for babies at 2110 Fifth Avenue South. The objective of the home, said a contemporary report, is to prevent mothers from giving away their babies by providing a home within their income, allowing them to see their children often, thereby keeping up the parental love. Close quotes. The mothers paid $1.25 a week towards the support of the home. When informed of her new undertaking, Bishop Whipple is said to have remarked, "God will provide for Sister Annette." He believed her when she said that. During her years at the Sheltering Arms and the Church Home for Babies, wrote a biographer, quote, "She received no salary, but on the contrary used her own money in her work, while her clothing, be it spoken were reverence, could hardly have been more expensive than that of the blessed Lord Himself." Close quote. In 1894, Sister Annette approached the Reverend John Jacob Fott, minister of Gethsemane Church in Minneapolis, with the idea of establishing a home for aged and infirm persons of the diocese. The project was not successful in Minneapolis, if indeed it was ever started. And on the advice of Bishop Gilbert of the Diocese of Minnesota, Sister Annette moved to St. Paul. She took a house at 17 Martin Street, where she opened a home for children and aged women. In a year or two, she moved to 5720 John Street, and in 1897, the diocese took over the home and incorporated it as an institute of the Protestant Episcopal Church, caring primarily for aged women. Sister Annette, as we heard, remained at the home as matron, nurse, and finally resident until her death in 1950. She is a saint, clearly a saint whose shoulders we stand upon. We heard the call of Jesus. When did you see me hungry? When did you see me naked? When did you see me in need of welcome? And she is a saint that we are grateful for in the Episcopal Church, and grateful that we all stand on her shoulders. We give thanks for her this day.
Bishop Carter, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Dave Kenny. I'm the author of the new history of Episcopal homes here. I have to tell you, for an author, the day that you get to see your book for the first time is pretty exciting, and I just laid eyes on it for the first time about 5 minutes ago. So if there are any mistakes in there, I apologize ahead of time, and I haven't had a chance to see those mistakes yet, but we'll just sort of pass that over. So it's great to be here with you. I had to solve a lot of little mysteries while I was researching the history of Episcopal homes. For one thing, I knew that the old church home, and that's what it was called for quite a while, the church home, bounced around from location to location in St. Paul during the years before and after the turn of the century, the 20th century. But it wasn't really clear how many locations there were or where they all were, so that took a little while to figure out. But the biggest of the little mysteries, I would say, that needed to be solved while I was working on this was the mystery of Sister Annette Ralph. Mystery might be too strong of a word, so we could say enigma, something like that. But keep in mind, I did know some of the basics of the outlines of Sister Annette's life, and we'll get to more of that in a moment. But I wanted to find out more about her if I could. She was the founder of Episcopal Homes, obviously, and it seemed only right that I try to gather as much information as possible before trying to piece together the whole history of the institution. But there were a few things that made it rather difficult to dig up any more information about Sister Annette. For one thing, she was a woman. And like most of the women at the turn of the century, she probably did not get the attention she deserved, at least not from the press at the time. It's striking how few of the newspaper articles I was able to come across that mentioned Sister Annette, even though she was really one of the busiest do-gooders in the Twin Cities during that whole period. And she should have gotten a lot of attention. I think it's fair to say that had she been Brother Annette, as opposed to Sister Annette, that she probably would have gathered more headlines than she did. And another factor that came into play was for this sort of skimpy paper trail, I guess you would say, was that she apparently had no real interest in public relations. I did come across one story written shortly after she moved her operation from Minneapolis to St. Paul, in which she gave a reporter a tour of the home. But I'm guessing that she didn't seek out that reporter. It was probably the reporter who sought her. And as far as I can tell, Sister Annette just liked to go about her business and didn't spend much time trying to gain credit for it. And that speaks well to her character, but it doesn't do much for researchers like me who are trying to track her movements a century after the fact. One other thing that was really a source of frustration was that photograph, this picture you see here. As far as I can tell, this is the only decent picture we have of Sister Annette. And again, there's a pretty simple explanation or a group of explanations for that. Mainly, photography was only just becoming a hobby of the masses at the time that Sister Annette was doing all her good works. So in some respects, we're even lucky to have this photograph, but it's still pretty frustrating because, you know, this picture gives a certain impression about Sister Annette, that she was quite a stern, no-nonsense lady. You can use any adjectives that you might come up with when you look at that photograph. And it may be that that impression has a certain amount of accuracy to it, but I suspect that Sister Annette was a little more complicated than that. And so to just have this one picture to look at and try to gain some insight into her character, that's a little too bad that we don't have more to work with there. So enough about trying to track down Sister Annette's past. We should probably move on to who she really was. After all, as a writer, you work with what you've got. And in the case of Sister Annette, we're probably not going to get any more information about her unless, by some miracle, she appears to us out of thin air.
I like these walker gadgets. I wish I had them 100 years ago. I'm speaking to you today as Sister Annette. If you live here, or if a member of your family lives here, or if you hope that someday a member of your family or you will live here, you're the people that I had in mind when I worked in the last 20 plus years of my life to plant a seed that had a little trouble with some place where I planted it, in the sense that we needed to have, am I eating this sufficiently? We had a little trouble in getting this the seed to sprout and grow through the mud and the ground it was planted in. But I think we can say that it has climbed above the soil level and is now flourishing in the sunlight. And I couldn't be happier. I want to give you a little information about me, since you have made an investment in this. Born in Kentucky, I had an auspicious beginning. My father was a graduate of Harvard. He ran a plantation. My mother was the daughter of a U.S. Senator and a Kentucky Supreme Court judge. My parents and 5 siblings were members of the Episcopal Parish Church, which my grandfather had been a founder of and was either a warden or a vestryman for 52 years. But then when I was 2, my mother died. The unrest leading to the Civil War began to impact us. My father moved the family to Missouri, which was still, unfortunately, in the Civil War world. I grew up there and was involved both in the difficulties of the war and its aftermath, which lingered in Missouri. My older sister, Hermione, left home when I was 19 to become a missionary in Africa, and she died there of yellow fever in 1961. My oldest brother, Richard, moved to Superior, Wisconsin, and I moved to join him to follow my dream. I felt called by God to be a servant of the poor, as my sister had, but chose Minnesota as my mission field. I had no material gifts to bring. Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple and other members of the emerging Episcopal Church there were very clear that they had no resources to support my vision. Although they welcomed me as a lay woman church worker. The bishop sponsored me for a year at a training school in Philadelphia for social work and nursing. And my first assignment after that was as matron of the Cottage Hospital in Minneapolis, an outreach of Gethsemane Episcopal Church, the mother church of the Twin Cities. The hospital was, as its name implied, a former residence cottage being used as a hospital. It was inadequate in every way for hospital care, which in those years was often more dangerous than home care when that could be done. That's when I began to be not only a dreamer, but an activist in meeting the needs of the vulnerable. I discovered I not only had vision to see what was needed, but the ability to make others see and be moved to help bring my vision to reality. In other words, I became a beggar on behalf of the needy, and that pretty much describes the rest of my service in Minnesota. I suspect that my contemporaries would add another word to their description of me. Persistent, or maybe stubborn, or at best determined. I felt that these were God's projects, not mine, and once the need was satisfied, I could move on. These weren't my babies that I had to hang on to. They were things that other people could pick up and continue, and they did. My first project was an improved hospital to replace the cottage. I was given city lots on which to build them, and the funds to erect the building and equip it, although medical technology was still in early development. Circumstances of surgery were unspeakable, and these were long before the days of penicillin. Nonetheless, the hospital provided better sanitation and facilities for the doctors And also, after my insistence, a free drug dispensary for those who could not afford the drugs they needed. That problem has not gone away. When the new hospital was completed, it was given the name St. Barnabas and served the population until, like many hospitals run by religious organizations, it had to become more technology-driven and was merged with a larger system. And I moved on to another dream. In the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, which my father gave me as a Christmas gift when I was 10, and which is the only possession of mine still in the hands of my family, there is a clipping pasted inside the front cover which begins, "No mother. She had no mother." Being a motherless girl was obviously a major loss to me, even though I suppose my 3 sisters and 2 grandmothers did their best. I still felt like an orphan. And as I saw all the orphans in the cities with no home, my focus on founding an orphanage was made clear. I rented space to begin, and in a year I was caring for 24 children. As far as funds go, the bishop had said God will provide for Sister Annette. And when I was asked about raising money for a more permanent establishment, I would say, if it's God's will, He'll provide the means. What that really meant was I became God's beggar. And the money that God had intended to invest in these projects were somewhere in the pockets or the bank accounts of the people that I knew. But until the funds were available, I paid out of my own pocket for the needs of the children with help from some Sunday school gifts. My begging was again productive, including 3 riverside lots as a building site. But I soon realized I couldn't do this alone. And I asked to have a board of trustees take over the financial management of the home so I could pay more attention to the children. When the new building was completed and the orphanage viable, I resigned. However, over the subsequent years, the trustees have been creative and resourceful, using the building for a polio hospital and a school for mentally retarded children and other needs of children, and then turning its assets into a fund which now makes yearly grants that benefit children in many ways. The 3 riverside lots are now the site of our senior co-op, Beckettwood. And there is a story that there was a chapel built for the orphanage called the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. When Beckettwood came into being, they moved the chapel, but somehow they thought a senior community would not be appropriately addressed as the Holy Innocents. So the chapel's name was changed. If you want to see it, it's there. I briefly tried to create a home for unwanted babies and unwanted and unwed pregnant girls rejected by their families. But that project was soon replaced in my dream with the need I saw for dignified housing for the aged of the community, especially women without husband, son, or other male support. The alternative was too often the poor farm, where living conditions were dismal at best. Many of you may remember the old marriage ceremony at which at some point the minister said, "And who is the man who giveth this woman to this man?" Sounds like property transfer to me. But that was the reality of those days, that women didn't even have first names. You were Mrs. Jones, you were Mrs. Robert Jones or Mrs. Samuel Smith. You weren't Betty or Susie or Mary. And So if you were a woman of age and had no support from a male person, it was very difficult to find a place to live out your days. And by the way, that isn't very ancient either, because I can remember friends who couldn't get mortgages because there were no male signatures, even though the financial part was perfectly satisfactory. My first effort in this business of finding a place to live in Minneapolis didn't work, so I came to St. Paul. I began with rented space, and we led a nomadic existence until the bishop, concerned about the fragility of finances, ordered the effort ended and the women sent to the port farm. We did not obey. A gift of $100 saved it. That doesn't sound like much, but if you do the money value analysis differences between what things paid for, what things cost in those days and now, that would have been in the thousands. Even so, I still had to go from door to door daily asking for food and money to meet the needs of the residents. The saga of the early years was not promising, but eventually the home was incorporated as the Episcopal Church home and then expanded to be the Episcopal Homes Complex. And here we are. If anyone had suggested that one day Episcopal homes would offer the opportunities that they now have offered in the city of St. Paul, a chapel, a memory cave, a therapy pool, not a nursing home, but a home, we would have thought they were crazy. I never began with anything like the funding requirements or the resident numbers that my small efforts have grown into today. I was always dealing with the few. My immediate neighbor, the sick in my small hospital and their families, the elderly person who had no place in the community, the folks on my doorstep, so to speak. I am so grateful that so many good-hearted, hard-working, clear-thinking people have chosen to build on the small efforts I made and have achieved a result that is hard for me to take in. I think that rather than this long speech, I should have just said, thank you for seeing my vision and for continuing my work and for your concern for the vulnerable of God's children of all faiths. I am so glad that others took my place when I couldn't go on, not as hirelings, but as those whose heart and soul is in the work. It was my prayer, and it has been answered more generously than I could have imagined. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Annette. I now invite you to stand as you are able, and let us sing a song of the saints of God. You may be seated for the conclusion of our celebration today, and I'll invite Shelley Ross to come and speak with you.
Well, clearly, after after meeting Sister Annette, after hearing the words about the saint that we celebrate today, I don't need to spend much time to talk about the importance of history. For those of you who know that I had spent some time at the Minnesota Historical Society in my career life, I have learned that one of the beauties of history is that sharing of stories and that translation that is passed down from generation to generation. And one of the things that sometimes happens are those stories are told and not translated into the written word. So as time continues, they become more vague and more difficult to actually capture. And that certainly was not something that we wanted to risk the loss of with both the story of Sister Annette and her creation here. As organizations grow, there's also that fear that you might lose a piece of the history or a piece of the true meaning of that taking care of the frail and the most vulnerable. And that too, we wanted to ensure was not going to happen with our history. So I went back to my history and went to Dave Kinney, who is one of the authors and one of those that we love to have do books for us when we're at the Historical Society. And so he blessed us with our history in writing, that we can not only read and share verbally with others, but that we also can read and cherish and continue our history as an organization up to the point that it was when the gardens and the terrace and Midway Point were all just an artist rendition. I thought it's almost too bad that we couldn't go back and add in one last page here in about 6 months that actually had the color version of it. But I want to thank both Dave Kinney and Mary Lilja for the work that Lilja Inc. and Dave did on giving us this piece of history. And as a thank you for all of the residents for putting up with that hassle and noise and construction and loss of direction and dust and some of those things that come with growth. Every resident is given a copy as our thanks for your being not only a part of our history now, but a part of our history going forward. You can pick up your copy today, or your managers will have them for you after today. Anybody else who's interested in them, they can be purchased for $10 a piece. And we thank everyone that's been a part of our history and everybody that continues to help us shape our history. So thank you.
It has all been said. This has been a wonderful celebration. Thank you for coming, and thank you just once again on behalf of everybody here and even from Sister Annette for the work that you do day in and day out to carry out her vision to care for the most vulnerable among us. So thank you, and I would like to also just give a special thank you to the Venerable Reverend Irma Wyman, who not only for this day, but in her own right has inspired many women to take their right and just place in the world. So thank you, Irma.